from the DoD and the Tech Transfer Program. And just kind of rules of the road, just all lines have been muted to ensure high quality audio. And today's session is being recorded. If you have any questions for the panelists as we go, we just encourage you to use the chat feature. That's where we will be picking up and looking at the questions you submit. And I now have the pleasure of introducing you to today's distinguished speakers, and there's 5 of them. So the first one is Dr. Michael Wallner. He leads the economic research team at TechLink. He oversees economic impact analysis for the Department of Defense, National Nuclear Security Administration, DoD inventions, and TechLink licensing, cooperative research and development agreements for the Air Force, Navy, and Army, as well as the first ever economic analysis for the National Cancer Institute. Michael focuses on conducting research and development analysis for DoD's defense mission, U.S. economy, and transitioning of technology to the U.S. warfighter. Michael also teaches applied statistics at Montana State University. He has a PhD in public policy and administration and is currently finishing his MBA, an overachiever. Brian Lewandowski is the Executive Director of the Business Research Division at the Leeds School of Business, University of Colorado Boulder. Brian provides regional business and economic information and education, including economic and revenue forecast, policy studies, economic impact analysis, and data workshops. Brian has 15 years experience conducting economic studies at Colorado University Boulder, or University of Colorado Boulder. Prior to CU, he worked in both the private sector and government. He currently serves on the boards of the Denver Association of Business Economists, the Association for University Business and Economic Research, and the National Association for Business Economics Regional Roundtable. The third speaker will be Bob McCoy, who's the director of the Geophysical Institute, home to about 400 faculty, staff, and students who study geophysical phenomena in Alaska and around the globe. The GI manages a diverse set of operational facilities that monitor volcanoes and earthquakes, launch rockets, fly unmanned aircraft, and downlink satellite data. Prior to coming to Alaska, Bob worked for the Navy for 30 years as a space scientist at NRL and ONR. He has a PhD in astrogeophysics from the University of Colorado Boulder and has several awards from NRL, NASA, and is a fellow of the American Meteorology Society. Brett Kusker is the Executive Director of the Montana State University TechLink Center, an economic development center of the Montana University system. TechLink operates as a partnership intermediary for the DoD and the Department of Veterans Affairs, as defined by 15 U.S.C. 3715, connecting innovation to the national security industrial base and U.S. innovation ecosystem in a cost-effective manner, supporting the warfighter and veteran requirements while bolstering the U.S. economy. TechLink also serves as a university connection to the high-tech sector in the state, region, and the nation. Brett is a retired Air Force colonel. Prior to coming to TechLink in 2016, he served as Chief Command and Control Division for the Air Force Acquisition at the Pentagon, where he was responsible for $4 billion a year acquisition portfolio. Brett has a master's degree in strategic studies, operational art and science, and human relations. And last but not least is Matt Fetro. He's the Director of Tech Engagement Office at the Air Force Research Lab in New Mexico. He leads the laboratory's tech transfer, STEM outreach, commercialization, innovation, and community engagement activities in the state. In addition, he has led numerous technology programs for the Air Force with a focus on space, remote sensing, laser remote sensing, and advanced photonics. Prior to his years of federal service, he worked in optical systems research and development at industry startups and in academia. Matt has his BS in physics from Utah State University and an MBA from University of Massachusetts. So with all that, let us go ahead and go to our first speaker, Dr. Michael Wallner. Michael.
Thank you very much, John. John, can you see my screen okay?
I can, sir.
Okay, great, thanks. So yes, welcome. My name is Michael Wallner, and today I'm going to brief you on one of our most recent economic impact studies of Air Force CRADA activities between 2000 and 2020. I'd also like to add that to our knowledge, this was the first ever CRADA-wide economic impact study of an entire DoD branch. We're very pleased that we have the resources and support of the Air Force, OSD, and DoD to complete such a groundbreaking economic impact study. At TechLink, we've actually conducted 20 national economic impact studies for DoD, OSD, the National Nuclear Security Administration, and the National Institutes of Health and the National Cancer Institute. And we'll be happy to take any questions that you may have at the end of this presentation. So for this study, our primary objective was to quantify the overall contributions of the Air Force CRADA program to the U.S. economy and defense mission. We also explored CRADA successes between the U.S. government and public and private partnerships, as we really wanted to focus on analyzing success beyond the numbers and impacts directly on the warfighter. We surveyed 886 companies with 1,263 CRADAs that were issued between 2000 and 2020. As a result of our findings, there was approximately $10.7 billion in sales of new products and services. There's approximately $4.3 billion in sales to the U.S. military. And according to economic implant modeling, there was $31.3 billion in total economic impact. And we will certainly cover total economic impact and implant modeling in more detail shortly. So part of what gets me the most excited about these economic impact studies is the significant downstream impacts and the ripple effects that spread throughout the U.S. economy, all from the signing of a CRADA. So from an economic perspective, it's quite impressive to measure the ripple effects from these CRADAs, and it's exciting that the Air Force is able to leverage these private sector funds to further develop and commercialize CRADAs that have significant downstream impacts on the U.S. economy. Acquisitions of companies, sub-licensing of technology, and spin-off companies created are really highlighted, as these successes usually don't happen unless the CRADAs that are signed show unique innovation and promise for development. So to start, there were 8 new companies that were launched based on CRADA technology. There was $479 million in outside investments for these small companies and large companies. There were 21 technologies licensed to other companies. There were 8 companies that were acquired based on this CRADA technology. And surprisingly, there were approximately 139,000 jobs that were supported over a 21-year period. So next, moving on to our survey and methodology that we employ is incredibly important for valid and reliable results. I'd like to mention that we obtained a 94% response rate, and I think it's really important to note that we attempt to deliver the most accurate, valid, and reliable economic impact studies possible. We're extremely dedicated to achieving a high response rate that ensures we obtain valid results. Obtaining a response rate above 40% for academic studies is usually considered a high response rate. For all 20 of our national economic impact studies, we've obtained a response rate above 92%, which we believe really proves that we're trying hard to tell the entire story of technology transfer using the most complete and accurate findings possible. So to begin with, on the lower left here for step 1, we begin by working with the appropriate labs and government agencies to obtain accurate and reliable information about the CRADAs issued to private sector partners. One of our biggest obstacles for these economic impact studies happens to be step 1. And the sponsoring agencies are incredible at trying to provide accurate and reliable information. Although, for instance, the Air Force for this study had to dig through file cabinets that were 20 years old and look for paper records and then transfer those paper records into Excel files to send to us. So we really appreciate how the Air Force was willing to go above and beyond and provide the most complete and accurate records possible. The second step is working with our internal team as well as the sponsoring agency to develop the survey. Once survey development is complete, we collect the data by contacting respondents, primarily all via telephone, and asking for a variety of economic impact information, as well as qualitative outcomes from these CRADAs, because we believe it's very important with CRADAs to measure qualitative outcomes because they might not always have a quantitative impact. After the data collection process is complete, we conduct an internal analysis of the data to output descriptive statistics, and we also send our data to our partners at the University of Colorado Boulder. We have Brian Lewandowski on the line today with me from UCB, and they conduct and complete the economic implant modeling, also known as the implant analysis. And lastly, we complete the report and success stories for internal and external use. Once reports are complete, we brief the sponsoring agency in whatever capacity they prefer. So moving on to economic impact modeling. So we're just going to start with something called direct impact. This is the initial economic activity that we are measuring in the economy. So this is a sale of a product or a service by a company. We gather this information directly in our survey. So for our survey, we had $10.7 billion in findings. We take this $10.7 billion and we input our findings into Implant. Now, with a high response rate for valid and reliable findings, as I previously mentioned, we input those numbers into Implant modeling to better understand the specific impacts as well as the ripple effects in the U.S. economy. Implant is one of 4 leading models for determining economic multipliers. It's undoubtedly the most widely known. Implant is based on Nobel Prize winning economic research, and it was originally designed in the 1970s, believe it or not, for a federal government agency, the U.S. Forest Service. So Implant is a perfect model for our economic impact studies, we believe, because it allows us to work at the county, state, or zip code level when we're analyzing our findings. And this can really help us focus on detailed outcomes. Implant modeling is also currently used by the BLM and Army Corps of Engineers in present-day economic impact studies. Next, as a result of Implant, we get something called an indirect impact. So these are inter-industry purchases between companies in the U.S. economy. Implant modeling estimated this at $10.4 billion based on our survey findings. Lastly, as a result of Implant, we get something called an induced impact. So this is household spending of payroll on goods and services, which Implant estimated at $10.2 billion. And then once again, coming in from the far left, we have our direct impact of $10.7 billion. So these 3 total outputs, indirect, induced, and direct, equal $31.3 billion in total economic impacts from United States Air Force CRADA activities between 2000 and 2020. One very interesting finding from this study is the CRADA partner by size. So as I'm sure many people are aware, we often conduct the DoD licensing economic impact study every 3 years, and the majority of those partners are small businesses. But for this CRADA economic impact study, we found that large companies with more than 500 employees contributed to 54% of the CRADAs, whereas very small companies with 1 through 9 employees had only 11% of CRADAs for the entire economic impact study. And throughout our economic impact study process, we're really starting to focus on discovering impactful successes and impactful success stories that are helping DoD agencies better tell the story of technology transfer and, of course, warfighter impacts. Private sector CRADA partners have a very positive working history with the Air Force. When we speak with these partners, they're almost always excited and willing to partner with the Air Force on success stories, and I would argue that many of them are appreciative for the opportunity to sign the CRADA and work on it with the Air Force or the appropriate federal government agency. It's quite clear from these conversations with the private partners that the personnel working for the Air Force T2 program are really making a difference for these public-private partnerships, of course, our warfighters, and lastly, congressional reporting. So I do want to touch on just 3 quick success stories as a result of these CRADAs. The first was a success story for Generation Orbit when they partnered with the Air Force under a CRADA in, I think, 2013 to improve the technological maturity of air launch systems for suborbital and orbital payloads. This was certainly the catalyst for developing the X-60A hypersonic flight research vehicle, which is an airdropped liquid rocket designed for hypersonic flight research, high temperature environments, and autonomous control. The next success story is from 2016 when Braxton partnered with the Air Force to improve satellite ground operational capacity, with a primary focus on reducing cost. So the infrastructure was used for research, development, and testing to improve systems, operations, messaging, and commercialization. Braxton's currently working on developing and enabling U.S. satellite navigation systems to also operate electronic jamming, spoofing, and cybersecurity attacks, which are incredibly important for the warfighter. And lastly, we have ABL Space Systems partnered with the Air Force to ensure the military could benefit from a rapid satellite launch system that focuses on launching multiple smaller satellites compared to one larger satellite launch, which will certainly help with maturing technology for more dynamic, robust, and rapid launch operations on very short notice. I'd like to stress that all of these success stories are, of course, concrete examples of how the Air Force T2 program has substantial impacts on the warfighter and really help tell the story of a successful Air Force T2 program. We're currently finishing about a dozen of these success stories, and they should be available on the TechLink website rather soon. And they're, of course, also available upon request to really see the impacts on the warfighter. So lastly here, I just want to summarize our economic impact study. It's quite clear that the Air Force CRADA activities and public and private partnerships resulted in 1,263 CRADAs that were issued to 886 companies and had major impacts on private and public partnerships. Our findings are clear that Air Force CRADAs strengthened the national security innovation base by supporting nearly 139,000 jobs over a 21-year period, with a total economic impact of $31.3 billion. And furthermore, these success stories that I just identified help DoD, OSD, and the Air Force tell the story of how CRADAs are impacting U.S. warfighter, as well as the story of the impact that technology transfer has on military advancements and private and public partnerships, which resulted in $4.3 billion in transition sales from this economic impact study. And at this time, I'm actually going to transition this presentation to my colleague, Brian Lewandowski from the University of Colorado Boulder. He is our senior implant modeling expert on the team, and he's going to briefly talk about breweries, which I'm sure most of us love attending and having a drink from. So Brian, I will let you take it over.
Great, thank you, Michael. Dr. Wallner asked me to join the conversation today to sort of demystify economic impact analysis. And I understand that most of you are FLC members, and many federal labs nationally conduct their own economic impact of your organizations. So hopefully you're at least a little bit familiar with what economic impact studies show. Very generally, economic impact is a way to broadly measure changes in the economy. This sometimes involves examining economic shocks like natural disasters, a fire, a flood, or hurricane, or the impact of policy changes on the economy. Other times, this means taking a look at how a change in one industry impacts a broader economy, and that's essentially what we have done in this study. So economic impact analyses may be conducted for a variety of reasons. Sometimes we're looking at the trade-offs between economic development projects. It might be to celebrate or market to stakeholders the economic contributions of an activity. Other times it's to fulfill policy mandates, such as looking at economic incentives or NEPA analysis. And then occasionally it's used to demonstrate an ROI, and that's very similar to what we've done in this case. How does it work? The economy is a web of interacting forces of buying and selling in the economy, of hiring and separating, of investing and building and innovating and so on. Ultimately, in economic impact, we're mapping the change in spending through an economy. So using input and input-output model like Implant, as Michael was describing, we have a map of industry expenditures, of those inputs to production. And we also have a map of spending between industries and between locations or between states. So from a procurement standpoint, think about what companies buy during a startup stage or during an expansion stage or through everyday operations. So to illustrate this, I did come up with this brewery example because I think a lot of us can hopefully relate to this. When a brewery is starting up, they're making some major investments. They're securing a building, they're buying a fermenter, and they're buying other equipment. So think about who they're buying those goods from. So the renting of the building or the buying of the building has an impact on the real estate industry, has an impact on the construction industry, and then the equipment that they're buying has an impact on the equipment manufacturing industry. And all of those industries, all of those companies behind those industries are hiring their own employees, and they're buying their own inputs to make these things. And so this is really that indirect impact or that supply chain impact that spending has throughout the economy. Think about that same brewery once they're in a production stage. They're buying barley and hops, which impact wholesalers, and before the wholesalers, it impacts farmers. And so all of those organizations along the supply chain have their own inputs to production. If it's the farmer, they have farm equipment, they have seeds, they have water and fertilizer and farm equipment. So it's this exchange of money that just turns over time and time again, which is really described as the multiplier effect. So any of that supply chain spending by that brewery to buy other goods and services, this is called the indirect impact. As well, the brewery is hiring people like the two individuals in this picture to make the beer. And those employees are earning their salaries, they're going home and paying their rent or paying their mortgage, they're buying food and fuel and entertainment. And all of this is the household impact or the induced impact of spending. So think of all of you as employees or as proprietors. You earn your incomes and think about how you spend that money in your community. That money gets spent and respent, and even the few dollars that you spend at the grocery store, you are supporting a fraction of a job with your annual expenditures at the grocery store. So that's how economic impact analysis works. We're really trying to take a look at the interactions of direct spending within an industry, how it impacts spending in all of the other industries within the economy. Using the Implant Model, we are able to not only map spending between industries, as I mentioned earlier, but we're able to build models by location. We could build them by county, we can build them by state, as we did in this study. But what we're really doing is building a model that reflects an individual state's economy. A couple of key definitions for you to be aware of. In the study, we talk about gross output, which is just an economic word for sales. Then we talk about value added, which is pretty synonymous with gross domestic product or GDP. And so the difference there is gross sales is just total sales. Gross value added is stripping off those intermediate inputs to production. So in this brewery example, they are buying barley and hops and other inputs to production, but their value added is how they change those inputs into a final product for sale. And then a couple other terms in the study. Labor income refers to total wages, fully loaded wages, including bonuses. We also have proprietor income in there. And employment refers to a job year, full-time or part-time. So you can think of those as a head count. Can you please advance the slide? A couple of unique things that I want to describe about this study, because I've worked on dozens, perhaps even hundreds of economic impact studies during my time at the University of Colorado. I've been impressed with how the TechLink team has gathered data from these companies, looking back in time to understand sales and R&D associated with these CRADAs over a long stretch of time. And the way that they provide that data to me is we have R&D, which falls into one industry within the Implant Model, and then they have manufacturing or downstream production. And that production is classified by industry NAICS code. So when we go to the effort of doing the economic modeling, we're able to model it by specific industry within the Implant model. So it's not just a generic industry that we're analyzing, we're actually analyzing the industries that activity is conducted in. The other thing that's unique about this study is the TechLink team has gathered data by state. So we have R&D and we have manufacturing activity by state across the US. And that allows us to model the activity in the state where it occurs, but we're also able to do something called a multi-region input-output, or MRIO, which allows us to capture the residual trade between states. So if there's production that happens in Colorado, we know that not all of those goods and services for that supply chain can be sourced within the state of Colorado. We just don't have every input for production within the state. So those companies are invariably buying goods and services from other states, maybe even internationally, and the MRIO allows us to capture that trade that happens between states. So we're getting a much more inclusive picture of the total activity in the US. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Wallner, I think, to take a few questions.
Yeah, this is John. We had one question, and then I have one. The one question we had from David was, how were the company sizes segmented?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you very much. So I will actually just go right from the report here, but this will be available obviously after this webinar. So we have company size. Large companies are 500 plus employees. Mediums are 100 through 499. Small are 10 through 99, and very small are 1 through 9 employees. So I hope that answers that question. The full report is available on the TechLink website, or it's obviously available upon request to Brian Lewandowski or myself, and all of that data is included in the report. Thank you, John.
No, thank you. And I tell you, for those who are in attendance, please put your questions in there, and we will actually move smartly to Bob for the next part of the presentation.
Thanks for inviting me. I've been on both sides of the CRADA interface between industry and the government. The Naval Research Lab has quite a number of space assets like vacuum chambers, shake tables, spin balance, and CRADAs were a vehicle to allow industry in the DC area to come into the Naval Research Lab and use those facilities. So that was one side of it. Here in Alaska, we've been working with the Air Force Research Lab, the Space Vehicles Directorate, to operate the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, HARP. HARP is about 250 miles south of us. It's a big ham radio. It's the most powerful and exquisite radio in the world. It's powered by 5 tugboat generators. You generate 12 megawatts, and we can transmit 3.7 megawatts. What you can do with HARP is take a region of the sky overhead and turn it into a laboratory, create artificial aurora, generate waves, do things like demonstrations like over-the-horizon radar, and quite a number of things. HARP was built by AFRL and also Naval Research and DARPA for about $290 million. And in 2012, AFRL decided they didn't want it anymore. It was too expensive to operate. So they pretty much gave it to the university in several steps. First step was an EPA, Educational Partnership Agreement. And through that, they transferred the hardware to the University of Alaska Fairbanks. To allow us to operate the facility, we entered into a CRADA with AFRL. And the third part was the land. The land transfer has been much slower. HARP was originally it had been mothballed. It took us about a year and a half to unmothball it at the university, open it up again, and now Naval Research Lab and AFRL scientists are coming in to use HARP. We just completed a campaign with NRL scientists yesterday, and through this CRADA, which is timed out and had to been redone several times now, we're bringing in lots of other scientists. The National Science Foundation gave us a $10 million grant for over 5 years to keep the facility open. So this has been a really real success story. It's a very powerful facility. It's capable of all kinds of things that can be done nowhere else in the world. And because of the CRADA, we're keeping the facility open to Air Force and Navy experimenters, as well as the entire scientific community. So we're pretty excited about this. It's been a bit of a struggle, but it looks like it's sustainable, and the CRADA was a very powerful vehicle to make this happen. So we're a big fan of CRADAs. And with that, I'll take any questions if there's any about our example of how we've used CRADAs here with the Air Force.
Thanks, Bob. I think we'll go ahead and take all the questions at the end and move on to Colonel Cusker.
Okay, thank you, John. Yeah, so this is a fascinating study, and the reason that I'm going to take a couple of minutes here, an opportunity to talk, is just as Michael Wallner mentioned, TechLink's done a significant number of these impact studies, and every single one of them is so exciting to discover what's actually happened with the research, the connection to the defense industrial base, the national innovation ecosystem is really quite motivating. And so to give you a little bit of a lens through the way we look at it here at TechLink, and then kind of couch that based on my experience at SAF AQ when I was in the service, I tell you the connection between our researchers and the industry partnerships that they build, and those friendships and those capabilities that they create together, undeniably transformational. It is so motivating to hear these successes, to be able to put them in not only a quantitative report, but as Michael mentioned, a qualitative report. This is so important for each and every one of us in the government to be able to explain the full value of these kind of cooperative research and development agreements, that public-private partnership story. That P3 story, part of a methodological approach to be able to describe value, commitment, and connection, is motivated by the personal successes that we see by your researchers in your labs, your ORDAs, and everybody that's out there helping with the technology transfer and the technology transition world. But it's also helping tell that industry success story in ways that I think really translates into an organizational pride. That pride, being part of a winning team, being part of a leading research country, where we should and we are taking the leadership role in areas that nobody else is willing to do. And a lot of areas that, it's for the betterment of human society, is really, I think, quite important, and it's quite motivating. And I think industry is engaged. I think they are motivated. I think they're looking for opportunities to work with your labs and your researchers. So a little bit of a plug for what you're doing out there. It's definitely exciting. TechLink is very interested in continuing to do these studies for the Department of Defense and other federal agencies. We're very proud of the fact that we've got Dr. Wallner and his team, and we partner so successfully with Brian down at UC Boulder to put these kind of reports out so that we can help you tell your story, regardless of who your stakeholder is. So it's been a really fabulous path, and I know Matt's got some stories for us here to kind of round out this. But that's my 2 cents worth about the value of what we're doing here as a reflection of the return on investment that each of you are making every single day. Thanks for the opportunity.
Matt, you're next, sir.
Thanks, John. So I thought I'd just kind of finish up the prepared comments from everyone today with sort of a perspective from the mission, the mission side of things. At the Air Force Research Lab, our job is to provide technology options to the Air Force and Space Force. And really by that, actually, I mean industry that supplies that force structure to the Air Force and Space Force, right? Here's the secret, we don't actually build this stuff ourselves, right? Industry is where we purchase that from. And so I've seen in my role here as the outreach guy in New Mexico for the last 6 years or so, we're increasing our use, really strategic use of CRADAs to go ahead and provide those tech options. So Michael and Bob, gave you some success story examples. I just wanted to give one or two more because we're really thinking of different ways to partner with industry and with universities, even using CRADAs to get some mutual gain. So one of our big challenges in the Space Force is really tracking objects in space. We often call it space domain awareness, or SDA, because apparently in the DoD we've got to do everything with 3 letters. And the challenge there is that it's very sparse data. We don't get very many measurements of objects in space, so we've been looking to use advanced algorithms to try to sort through all the gaps in the data. And so one of the neat things is that over the last many years, we've been working with all sorts of different groups who have advanced algorithms. Maybe they came from non-space applications. Maybe it's automated cars, those sorts of things. And rather than doing contractual arrangements with those companies, which of course is time-consuming and expensive, we've really been using CRADAs to leverage those companies' expertise. And a typical arrangement is one where they get something out of it as well. Of course, they get data. Right? We have space-based data, ground-based data that we can offer them. And in return, what we do with these various CRADAs is they are able to demonstrate to us how those algorithms might perform. And again, we've done many of these over the last few years. And again, it's something that I think really enhances our mission, provides something to the Space Force, but also then creates economic growth, right? Those companies can then start selling their services for space domain awareness to commercial companies and others. That's just been great. One final example I'll give of use of CRADAs is actually relates back to our GPS and that NTS program that Michael mentioned. We often will work with companies to develop technology, but then when we want to procure more of that, right? We want to actually transition to what we call a program of record, right? We actually want to work with as many companies as possible. So we'll sometimes use CRADAs to transition technology that the government owns through the research that we pay for to a wealth of companies, right? So that they can understand the research that we did and bid back better technology options to our programs of record. We've done that a lot on the GPS efforts, NTS3 in particular is the program, as we're looking to modernize that system for the nation. So again, I'm just really thrilled to be here today and to report the strategic use of CRADAs, at least at our organization, has really picked up over the last few years. And with that, I'll give it back to John and take any questions.
Thanks, Matt. So you got a chance to listen to the creative partner, the lab, and then the perspective from Brett from when he was at the Pentagon, actually. And so you're starting to see this holistic picture of what one agreement might do. And some of the questions I had, guys, and I think probably the first ones that I had was for Brian and Michael, but obviously anybody can jump in, is I'm a huge fan of these studies. And what I hear and when I saw what Michael was presenting was basically a $10.6 billion impact from those Air Force CRADAs that were numbers that were given from the actual companies. And then the implant model more or less assigns a ripple effect, ultimately about a 200% increase, taking about $3.4 billion. Do I have that right, or ballparkish?
Yeah, that was on the slide. Yeah.
I mean, I'm a layman, right? So I'm definitely not an economist. So I just want to make sure I got that right. And basically, one of the questions I had is, who else is using Implant to understand the effects of economic activities like that? I know you mentioned some of them, but where is this widely accepted?
So, John, I'm going to have this question to Brian Lewandowski.
Sure. This is Brian. So Implant was initially developed within government to analyze land use decisions. And since it was one of the earliest tools, first tools, it ended up being the only tool that was used for a long time. And it's still used by the federal government in an official capacity from the Forest Service and the BLM. But it's also used by many research outfits at universities to study the economic impact. There are some other tools that are out there now. I've used most of these to study the impact. MZ is one that has come around in, I think, maybe the last decade or so. It's a good tool. It's out of Idaho. That does a very similar job in mapping industry interactions and industry spending patterns. There's REMI, that's out of Amherst, Massachusetts. There's the BEA multipliers from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and that's a foundational tool for many of these other tools. So I've done studies where I even take a look at all of them side by side and see what sort of impacts we get, and we get similar impacts regardless of which tool you use. But I do find that Implant is cited most often in these studies, and perhaps it's because they've been around the longest. But what we find is it's a widely cited tool for analyzing those industry connections.
Yeah, and it makes perfect sense that you get that ripple effect. I do have another question here. Are there any common characteristics of the most successful CRADAs? So, Michael, you've been through this iteration once. Any big takeaways like that yet?
Yeah, John, I guess I would say we're definitely seeing more CRADAs being more successful with some of the larger prime defense contractors, which I mentioned during my presentation is kind of the opposite of what we're seeing for our DoD licensing and TechLink licensing economic impact study. Second, I think it depends on how you measure success within your question. As I mentioned, we're really focused on measuring success as far as impacts on the warfighter as well as the economic impacts. And it's pretty safe to say that when a CRADA is successful, there's generally significant sales to the U.S. military, and those significant sales are having an impact on the U.S. warfighter. So for the Air Force, I mentioned 3 different success stories, all of which were essentially related to space. But we're also seeing some other success stories that you wouldn't anticipate as much that are having to do with environmental cleanup and oil spills. Some of them that are just accidental breakthroughs in technology while these companies are working on them. But I would say the most successful CRADAs, John, that we're seeing are 2 large defense prime contractors with a focus on having an impact on the warfighter, and where those large defense prime contractors already have significant resources and staff to further develop the research that was initiated through a federal government agency.
Thanks, Michael. What I heard you say there, and I'll confirm this with you, is that when it's with a large DoD prime or company, they're actually working toward a DoD problem set. And then, if I remember right, and your stats earlier, it was like a $4.3 billion transition, which I assume, and I'll let you correct me, but I think that 4.3 is where the DoD has bought back products or services that were developed under a CRADA. Is that correct?
Yeah, John, that's entirely correct. And so just real quickly to give you kind of a rundown here of statistics, and I'm going off of memory, so I may be 1% off, but for the large companies in the study, they had about 88% of total sales to the U.S. military. The medium companies, so 100 through 499, they had about 7% of sales to the U.S. military. Small 10 through 99 organizations had about 2 or 3%, and then very small had about 2 or 3%. So you can see right there with nearly 90% of sales to the U.S. military coming from these large defense contractors that certainly we're seeing more success.
So we really get to these economic impact studies, really get a good sense of really the business of how we can interact, the government can interact with different sizes of businesses, and how that kind of just plays out. So really seeing a granularity we would not get any other way. So just a phenomenal tool. And Matt says that AFRL, Air Force Research Lab, uses Implant through the University of New Mexico to estimate the impact of federal research on the New Mexico economy. And I think several labs have done that for local and state type economic benefit. Michael, David has another question. He says, how have you seen CRADAs advocated as an option to government agencies? And I think you may want to kick that one back to me. So how have you seen CRADAs advocated as an option to government agencies?
Yeah.
So CRADAs is, maybe CRADAs are one of the many tools that are available to the labs to collaborate with, even partner with the private sector, whether it's a company or whether it's a university or whether it's a not-for-profit. And it's probably the workhorse. I know in the DoD, we probably have 100 new CRADAs a year. And that actually may be low, but I thought I was just looking at those metrics earlier today. And so there's always an ongoing, probably up to 1,000 active CRADAs a year. So there's a lot of entities that are doing CRADAs with government labs, advocating for them. That's a good question. You know, we try to market, but I got to tell you, the government's not really good at marketing. Things like that. We try to get it out through entities such as the Federal Laboratory Consortium for Tech Transfer, which is hosting this today. And if you went to federallabs.org, which is their website, you'd see CRADAs as well as a lot of other type of authorities that we have given to us by Congress, where we can interact with non-governmental entities. And you can also see training on how to use CRADAs, as well as licenses and partnership intermediaries, different types of agreements. So, David, don't know if that
John,
answers your question.
I would just add to that
Yeah.
maybe Brett Cusker, Executive Director of TechLink, giving his previous.
So, Brett, I think Michael was inviting you to chime in.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not sure where Michael was going to go with that. It seems like he just dropped out. But I think your answer was really important for people to see that through the lens of your experience back at Crane and other places, especially from your foxhole there at OSD.
Yeah, it's not easy to, but I would tell you, when we have partners, when the labs have partnership intermediaries, part of the role of the intermediary is to help communicate that to the ecosystem and to the various players in it. And of course, TechLink and Miltech are the DoD's national partnership intermediaries. So if you went to and I'm sure I'm not going to get it right, but the website for TechLink, which is, I think, TechLink. TechLink Center.
Yeah, techlinkcenter.org.
You would see a whole host of that type of information as well, predominantly on licensing and IP, but TechLink also helps companies engage the right lab with CRADAs as well. So as I look for additional question, I know I had some, and when I think about the CRADAs and our knowledge about how that plays out on the licenses side, you know, once an agreement is signed, Michael, did you get any insight on how long does it take for a company to see some economic benefit, where we know with the license it's 5 to 10 years where they start to hit you know, some true good benefit? Did you get any sense of that from the CRADA study yet?
John, this is Michael Wallner. Can you hear me again?
I can, Michael. Thanks.
Okay, sorry. It kicked me off Microsoft Teams, so I've just rejoined. I only heard part of the question. I'm assuming that it was the length of time before a CRADA commercializes?
Yeah, or provides value back to the company like that, right, an economic value.
Yeah, so I think we're seeing qualitative values immediately to the company. From a quantitative perspective, we're seeing similar trends to licensing and SBIRs, although I will say with CRADAs, it seems as though some of the larger defense contractors have more immediate breakthroughs in years 0 through 5 as far as technology development and commercialization and benefit back to the companies. With some of the medium, small, and very small, we are seeing more in that 5 to 10 year window for technology development and commercialization before they're really having economic impacts on the U.S. economy.
Well, thank you, Michael. Dr. Pham has a question about how do we entice more companies to do CRADAs with DoD? Any thoughts on that from anyone on the panel? You all bring a different perspective on that one. Somebody was getting ready to chime in. Go ahead.
John,
I'll call you out then.
Yep.
Go ahead.
I'll go while we're waiting for others. We have Brett Cusker on the line. I'm not sure if we have our other panel members, but if we do, I think that this is a great question for them. But I'll just start here briefly by saying One thing that we're starting to do from an internal perspective is when we contact these companies, we're actually asking if they're interested in additional licensing or CRADA follow-up in the near future. And we have overwhelming support for recontacting them. And as you know, TechLink has some core metrics from a technology transfer perspective. And within those core metrics, we try and get CRADAs signed with private businesses all over the United States. So that's one way at TechLink that we're really trying to entice these companies to seek additional interest in CRADAs in the near future.
Yeah, and John, Brett here. So we know that most CRADA partners are coming through personal relationships that the PI or the researcher themselves make, whether that's just working within their field or going to different conferences and meeting people, just knowing, who else is doing or interested in research in their areas. So we know that that's a huge driver for partnerships, and it's a good one. One of the things that we're going to do here this year as part of our FY22 initiatives, just like we've created a national marketing engine to promote the opportunity of licensing DoD intellectual property, we're going to engage for certain laboratories that want to participate and researchers who are interested in participate. We're going to engage that marketing engine to find them a qualified partner to do CRADAs that they might not otherwise be able to find on their own. We're going to start this project small. We're right now in solicitation, so to speak, with the other service components to give us a researcher, a lab, an opportunity that we can kind of put into our marketing engine that's been refined and tuned specifically over the last few years to go out and find really high quality licensees. We're going to use the same mechanics to go find the best and the brightest to enter into or potentially enter into CRADAs with select labs across the country. We think this is going to drive and bring a very low barrier to entry, but a lot more interest in doing work alongside our researchers out there in the DoD community. So while we're going to start small, we're going to prove the model, which is typically what TechLink does, then we'll grow it from there.
Yeah, really looking forward to seeing that, Brett. And Bob, I'm going to end with you, sir, if you're still on the line. I'd love to know if after your experience with CRADAs and the Air Force, if you're actually considering any other ones.
Yeah, there's as you're aware, the Department of Defense has been coming out with lots of Arctic strategies, and being up here in Alaska, we have a lot of things available to us. We've had lots of discussions with various Air Force labs. A couple of years ago, we became a UARC, a University Affiliated Research Center, focused on geophysical detection of nuclear proliferation. So we think there's a whole bunch of stuff we could be doing in partnership with the Air Force and the Space Force. We're supplying ionospheric data to the Long-Range Discrimination Radar at Clear Space Force Station, and we're just getting started. We think there's going to be a whole bunch of stuff we're going to be partnering with the Air Force as the Air Force and the DoD takes a growing interest in the Arctic.
Well, Bob, as a former Navy guy, and as I'm a current Navy guy, I hope you're not you're limited to the Air Force at this point. So I'll just challenge you to reach back to the Navy as well.
Absolutely, and the Navy's getting a new ocean up here as the ice recedes. So and so there's quite a bit of activity, quite a bit of interest working with the Navy off the Naval Research, where I came from, but also working with the Air Force. But right now, the Air Force has a strong presence and growing presence in Alaska, with
Right.
F-35 squadrons and F-22 squadrons and new radars. It's quite a bit of activity.
Oh, absolutely. So, on behalf of the FLC, I would like to thank Michael, Brian, Bob, Brett, and Matt for this informative discussion, and thank all of our attendees for joining today. As a reminder, a recording of this webinar will be available for viewing on the FLC Learning Center within a few days of this event and is included in your registration. Visit the FLC website, federallabs.org, to view the recording or another webinar you may have missed. And please remember to complete the webinar evaluation, which will be emailed to you within the week, and this will help us serve your needs in the future. And we just thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye.